Today we're taking a look at Vue.js, which is a JavaScript framework that's going to let you create really cool web applications. So in today's tutorial, I'm going to show you how using a single HTML page, you can start to create Vue applications. And in the follow-on tutorial to this, I'm going to show you how you can use the command line interface to build out a more complete, a more comprehensive application with Vue. So in order to get started, I have the Vue.js website, so it's just vue.js.org. I'm going to click Get Started, and I'm going to scroll down here to this script tag. Now this script contains the JavaScript file hosted on a CDN that has all of the Vue code that we need to just get started. So I'm going to go ahead, copy this script tag, and then I'm going to go into my code editor, and I'm just going to create a new file, and I'm just going to call it index.html. Any HTML file will do here, and I'm just going to fill in some boilerplate for HTML5. I don't actually need any of this, and let's just call this overview. Into the body tag, I'm going to paste that script that I just had. So I've pulled in the development version here. You can, of course, do the same because we're just sort of building a one-page application. I'm going to close my file explorer there. And now I'm just going to sort of enter in the minimal amount of code that we need to start running this Vue application. So in order to do this, I'm going to come down below where I've imported that script, and I'm just going to open up a script block here. Of course, in a real setting, you're going to want to extract this to external files, but for now, this will work just fine. I'm going to type in var app equals new Vue. So this is going to create an app variable, and it's going to be a Vue object. Now, to this Vue object, we need to pass in a JavaScript object, which contains some of the data that we essentially need to create our Vue application. And the one thing that we need to provide it for sure is the HTML element that's going to hold our application. So the way we do that is we come in and we specify EL, and then we give it the identifier of the HTML element that our application is going to live within. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to have #app. So we want to create an HTML element with the ID of app, and that's where this Vue application is going to live. So I'm going to come up here, and I'm just going to make a div with the ID of app, and I'm going to save this file. So if I come in here and I copy the path, and then I go to my web browser, and I paste in this path, you can see that we just get a blank page loading here. I'm going to open up the console here, and I'm just going to type in app, and you can see that we have this Vue object here, right? So there's plenty of stuff being provided, but this right here is actually going to be our Vue application. So, you can see that if we type in L, we get this div ID app. So clearly what we've done has been working, but up to now, it's not super interesting. So let's start actually looking at some of the things we can do. So the first thing that I want to do is just create our Hello World application. So in order to do this, I'm going to come in here, and Vue has a templating language built in. So if you've worked with Flask, it's going to be similar to the templating language there. What I'm going to have is two curly braces, and I'm going to type message here. Now what this is going to do is this is going to echo out the message variable from our application. Now, right now, this is obviously not defined, but in order for us to add this, we need to come down to this Vue object that we're initializing here, and we're going to add a data property. So the data property is going to be an object itself, and within here, we can start naming the different variables that we want our application to work with. So I'm going to define the message variable, and I'm just going to call it the string that says hello world. If I save that, I can go back into my application here, can refresh, And you can see we get hello world. Just going to zoom in on this for you. So, obviously not very exciting, but now we can start to see the power of Vue when we start to play around with the console here. So as I was showing you before, in this console, we have this apt object. Now, I can reach in and actually go to any of the data that we've defined directly off of this app object. So if I go app.message, you can see our hello world message is stored there. Now what's interesting is if I go app.message equals welcome to Vue.js, you can see that updates the message here, but it automatically refreshes the message inside of our application. So this is starting to show you the types of things that we're going to be able to do with Vue, because if we had some code that ran that changed that message, you can see that as soon as the message changed, it automatically updates in the browser. So if I come back in here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a span. And my idea with this span is that I want to either show or hide the message depending on a variable. So if I say this is hidden, then my goal is that I want some data element here to be either true or false. And if it's true, then I want that to be shown. And if it's false, I want it to be hidden. So I'm going to come in here. I'm going to create a visible variable within our data object here. And I'm going to set that to be false. Now up in this span, I'm going to type in v_if equals visible. So this v hyphen, that's going to tell you that we're working with some sort of Vue directive. So v dash, and then there's going to be plenty of different directives that we provided here. But the simplest one to think about is if. And so if is going to evaluate the expression that we have here. And if that's true, it's going to include this element. And if it's not true, it's not going to include that element. So, of course, we can go back into the browser here. We refresh, and you see that nothing's changed. But if I go app.visible, and I set that equal to true, now you can see this is hidden, shows up. Obviously, you wouldn't want a constant variable in your data object that's going to be used to show or hide different elements, but you could think that if this is some expression, then we'd be able to show or hide this variable based on a variable expression. Just like we have ifs, so we have conditionals within Vue, we also have loops. So one thing that you might want to do is output a list of items. If I come down in here and I'm going to say items, and I'm going to define it to be a JavaScript list here. So each of these I'm going to define to be an object, and I'm going to give it a text property, and that text is going to just contain some string here. Now, once I go back in and we start building out this thing, my goal is to just have the JavaScript echo out all of these things sort of by itself. So the way that we're going to do this is we're going to come up here and I'm going to make an ordered list item, and then I want to output a different li for every single element in that list. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create that li, and then I'm going to say v-for. So again, we have this syntax v hyphen, and then this directive. The for specifies that it's a for loop. And the way that we're going to specify this is we're going to say item in items. Now this first variable definition here can be anything you want. This is just how we're going to reference it within the loop itself. And this items refers to our data items element. So within here, I'm going to come in and I'm just going to echo out item-text or item.text. So this is going to reference the text property for every single item in this list. Now, if we go back to the browser, we refresh, you can see we get these items echoing out here. Maybe each of these items is actually a to-do item, right? And so we're going to have some status on it. We're going to say it's either complete or it's not. So I'll just add a complete. I'll add complete true to the second item there, and I'll add complete false to the rest of them. So if we've completed the item, then what I want to do is I want to have a line through the item here. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to add a span, and we're going to say class equals complete. And then I'm just going to come up to my head here. I'm going to add style, and I'm going to say span.complete, and I'll add text decoration line through. Okay, now if I were to put the text within this span, come back here, refresh, you can see that all of them are being crossed out. And the reason that they're all being crossed out is that we're just adding this complete class to all of them. So that's not exactly what we want to do. Instead, we only want to add this class if todo.complete is equal to true. So you could think about trying to do this with the conditional, but in fact, we can use binding in Vue. So if I say vbind :class, what this is going to say is we're going to bind a class to this span depending on what we provide in here. So within the quotation marks here, we need to provide a JavaScript object. And now essentially, this object is going to bind specific classes based on whether or not the conditions that we provide hold. So I'm going to say vbind class complete, and we want to bind this complete when item.complete is true, right? So it can just do complete : item complete. So if this is true, then we're going to add the complete, and then what we should find is when we go back and refresh our page, that we only have the second item being crossed out. So that's exactly what we have, and if I actually inspect that item, you can see that it has a class of complete, whereas the other ones do not. Of course, I could come in here and say incomplete, and then say not item.complete. And maybe if I come up here and I say span.incomplete, and I go color tomato, then when we pull this back up and I refresh, you can see now all of these ones are going to have a span of incomplete. This one's going to have a span with the class of complete. So of course you can keep providing more elements into that dictionary, and it's going to bind them based on whether it's true or not. So now what I want to do is actually show you how the user can start to interact with this page. And in order to do that, I'm just going to build up a simple counter. So essentially what I want to do is I want to have a count being echoed out here, right? So of course, in order for this to be echoed out, we need to come into this data. We need to add a count of 0. And then beneath that, I want a button that's going to have a +1, and I want a button that's going to have a -1. So we can count up or down by 1. So if we come in here, refresh, you can see that right now we get that count being output, but obviously clicking these buttons isn't doing anything. So how are we going to go set this up? Well, if you're working in standard JavaScript, you're going to want to do something like bind an onClick equals function here. And then this function is going to have to handle how we're going to do the plus and minus to the count. And then you're going to want to update what's being output here. Now doing this in Vue is actually incredibly straightforward. So essentially we need 3 parts. The first is that we want to specify what Vue is reacting to. So we're going to use v-on, and then we specify the event that we're reacting to. So v-on-click. And within here, we're going to provide a method name. So I'm just going to call it add1. In order to actually have this called, we need to define this add1 method. And where we're going to do that is we're going to come down into this Vue object that we're creating. And beneath data, I'm going to define methods. And this is going to be an object itself. And then within this methods object, we're going to define every method that we're sort of capturing with actions within our Vue application here. So now I'm going to say add one, and it's going to be a function. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to call this.count, so it's referring to the data count, plus equals 1. Now if I save this, and we open this back up here, I refresh. When I click +1, you can see our count is automatically counting up. So we want to do essentially the same thing for the subtract 1 button here. So we're going to do v_on_click equals sub1. Then we need to add this method. And I say sub1 function this.count minus equals 1. And now if we go back in here, we refresh, you can see we can add or we can subtract 1 using these buttons. You can start thinking about how you might be able to expand this to allow for sort of more complicated functionality. So now I want to go in and just clean up some of what we've done and then show one last cool thing with Vue, and then you'll have sort of all of the tools you need to start playing around with Vue.js. So if I come back in here, you can see this v_on_click. You can imagine that if you start building out more complicated applications, this is going to get tiresome rather quickly. And so Vue actually provides a shorthand, and that shorthand is, instead of saying v_on:, we can just simply type the @ symbol and then the event. So @click, we're going to call the add1 function, or @click, we're going to call the sub1 function. So obviously if we come back in here, it's working exactly the same way. Now they provide these shortcuts in some other places. So for instance, instead of saying vbind class, if I just type :class, the vbind is implicitly assumed there. So again, we can go back in here, refresh, you can see that we still get the class bindings correctly. So the last thing that I want to show you is what's known as two-way binding. So instead of having this message just echoed out here, what if we wanted the user to be able to set the count, but also use the buttons to add or subtract 1? So we might include some input field here, just be a text field. We don't necessarily need a name or an ID, but maybe you'd think to do this value, and we just output the count here. Now if I go back into the web page, refresh, you can see we're getting this error. And if we read through, you can see interpolation inside attributes has been removed, used vbind or the : shorthand method. What this is essentially saying is that you can't directly echo this out. And that's okay, because one thing that you could do is we could say we want to vbind the value, and we're going to vbind the value to be equal to count. Okay, now if I go back here, I refresh, you can see the value is bound here. But then if I update and I make this 3000 and I subtract 1, you can see we're back down to 2. So while we get it bound so that it updates inside the text field along with this message, you can tell that this text field isn't really containing the value of count because it just gets overwritten every time we change that. So that's not exactly what we want. Instead, we're looking for something called two-way binding. And what we mean by this is that we want this text field to contain the value of count, but also to update the value of count whenever it's updated. And so, of course, you could do something like @keyup equals, set count, and then take the set count function to set the value of count to be equal to whatever its value is whenever it's updated. But Vue actually makes this easier to do right off the bat. So what we're going to do instead of vbind value is we're going to say vmodel equals count. And this vmodel directive is going to let us know that we want to two-way bind this count variable to the value of this form. So now if I come back in, load up my browser, I refresh, you can see we get this 0 started here. And if I add or subtract to it, it's working as we'd expect. But now, if I start to update this value, you can see this message is updating alongside it. So we're actually updating the value of count, within this as we go. If I come in and I start hitting my buttons again, you can see it starts from where we pick off. Now, one strange thing about the way that I've implemented this exactly is, let's say that I say 200 here, and then I hit +1. You can see we go to 2001, and then 2011, and so on. And the reason is I'm not being very careful about my data types, and so when you update the text field, it thinks it's an integer, or it thinks it's a string, and then when you add 1, it's concatenating that on. But for the most part, that'd be an easy workaround by just making sure that you're parsing everything as an integer. So to recap what we've sort of looked at is you see that just by pulling in this script here, you can start to build out these Vue applications. We've seen that there are directives that allow you to sort of functionally manipulate your page, so whether that's a conditional or a for loop. We can use class binding so that the styling of the page is conditional on data that we have. We also looked at how to bind methods to user input, right? So we saw it with clicking a button, but the principle is going to be the same regardless of what action they're performing. And we talked about two-way binding and how to use inputs to be bound to data that we have directly. So this is sort of the minimal amount that you need to start building out these applications, and you can actually get quite far just by working on these. But if you want to kind of take it to the next level and unlock all of the power that Vue has, you're going to need to start thinking about using components, and you're going to want to start looking at the routing system that Vue has and start sort of manipulating things at a greater level. So in order to do that, my recommendation would be to take a look at the video that I have about how to install Vue.js, and then from there, take a look at the next tutorial in this series, which is going to be using the command line application to generate a full-fledged Vue application, where I walk through that and show you how you can do all of the same types of things that we're doing here in a more scalable manner.